In class, we got an introduction to the topic of ideology, and we explored the function that ideologies serve. The cartoons we examined were rather obvious examples of ideologies, at least in the eyes of educated adults like yourselves, although others fully believe the ideologies of manifest destiny and pluralism. However, most ideologies, like the culture of poverty, are presented to us in far more subtle ways. So let's start with a quick overview of this culture of poverty thing. Think back to when we examined the structural versus cultural perspectives on inequality. Recall that the structural perspective on race and poverty focuses on unequal opportunities and competition. On the other hand, there's the cultural perspective, and this is where you'll find the idea of the culture of poverty. In keeping with the cultural perspective, the culture of poverty highlights the role played by bad values in the emergence of social inequality. In other words, the culture of poverty theory states that a culture that devalues hard work, discipline, ambition, and sacrifice for the future results in laziness, and this laziness results in poverty. Moreover, this culture of laziness and poverty is socialized and passed down from one generation to the next, which is why it is called the culture of poverty. In other words, laziness is a defining characteristic of this culture among the poor. So the assumption here is that the poor are poor not because of structured inequalities, but because they are lazy and they and their children are likely to stay that way. The implied counterpoint to that is that the rich are rich because they are hardworking, and they and their children are likely to stay that way. What we've done in our society is taken the idea that laziness results in poverty and turned it around. So we also believe that poverty gives rise to laziness. In other words, they're seen as equivalent. Laziness equals poverty, and poverty equals laziness, as if they automatically go hand in hand. However, there are two big problems with this theory. First of all, there's an underlying assumption that links poverty with particular races, and so we come to associate poverty and the laziness that goes with it with that race, African, Latinx, and Native Americans in particular. Asian Americans are not, because they are currently set aside as the, quote, model minority. This racial group is held up as an example of, quote, good values, especially as represented by the stereotype of the tiger mom. We also speak in a code of euphemisms, such that we say things like inner city, which is an economic reference, and what we actually hear and think about is Black people, Latinos, and Native Americans. The second result is the fact that we blame the victims. Again, we think the poor are poor because they are lazy, not because there's something wrong with the system or because they had unequal opportunities to begin with, as the structural perspective argues. And when we blame the victims, we justify or legitimate inequality by finding defects in the victims of inequality. We can feel better about ourselves when we assume others are responsible for their own failure to get ahead. Overall, this theory, the culture of poverty, is very negative toward the poor and racially oppressed. And because of this negative perspective and the fact that it doesn't take social structure into account, structural theorists are highly critical of using culture and values as an explanation for inequality. On the other hand, there are some things that are informative about this culture of poverty theory. For example, you can use the economic class of a parent to predict the future economic success of their children. Something is passed down. At the very least, the disadvantage itself is passed down. But on the other hand, this is also true of the wealthy. Something is passed down there as well. And there really are some people out there who are lazy and who don't want to work or plan for the future. In other words, we can't entirely dismiss this culture idea. Yes, Structural factors, the fact that people have unequal opportunities, are very, very important. But is it the entire picture? The question then is, how do we reconcile these two opposing perspectives? Or can we? Let's focus on this laziness idea. The culture of poverty theory tells us that poor people are lazy. But are all poor people lazy? And are all lazy people poor? Of course not. In other words, when you think critically about it, you begin to realize that a big part of the problem has to do with the name of the theory, the culture of poverty. This name automatically links a culture characterized by laziness with one class of people, the poor, as if you can't have one without the other. And yet, if not all lazy people are poor, such a connection is clearly very misleading. And this distinctively American ideology was so strong that for many years it never occurred to even social scientists to ask whether the rich could also be lazy. And yet we hear about things like the, quote, idle rich. Aren't the rich being lazy if they're idle? Given this problem, one clever sociologist, Chandler Davidson, decided to propose a different name for this cultural perspective. He suggested that instead of calling it the culture of poverty, we rename it the culture of shiftlessness. And suddenly, with this one simple change, the idea of being lazy or shiftless was no longer linked with just poverty. Now it was possible to study this culture no matter what class the person happens to be from. So now we can ask whether this culture of shiftlessness is more or less likely to be found among the poor than the rich, and by implication, among one race versus another. Before he renamed this perspective, it didn't even occur to anyone to ask that question. Talk about constructing reality. In his research, Davidson compared people from different class and racial backgrounds with regard to their work ethic and found that there was no statistically significant difference in terms of work values between the poor and non-poor in any racial or ethnic category. If anything, he found that, quote, ethnic minorities on average expressed more support for work-oriented values than the white majority, end quote. The marginalized know they have to work, and work harder than white people, if they're going to succeed. As an example, a study came out some years ago titled Great Expectations: How the Public and Parents, White, African American, and Hispanic, View Higher Education. In the study, they note that, quote, all Americans say higher education is important, but our survey shows that African American and Hispanic parents are significantly more likely than whites to emphasize the value of higher education, not less, end quote. For example, when asked to choose the one thing that can most help you as a person succeed in the world today, 33% of white parents identified a college education. By comparison, 47% of Black parents and 65% of Hispanic parents said that a college education was the most important thing needed for a person to succeed. In other words, shiftlessness or laziness is no more common among poor people or African, Latinx, or Native Americans than among any other class or race or ethnicity. But in his research, Davidson did find a difference between racial groups. He found that, surprise, some groups got paid more money and other compensations for their work than other groups, and those groups were middle to upper class white. In other words, some people have better opportunities than others. That's the kind of data that's in direct support of the cultural perspective. Given all this evidence, we can ask, why is it that the culture of poverty idea persists in our society, despite all the evidence against it? The reason it persists is that it is an ideology that rationalizes the unequal distribution of wealth in the United States. And just like all ideologies, it shapes our perceptions of the facts. It distorts our impressions of what's really going on. Using phenomenology, it's a constructed reality that is inaccurate, but one that persists because it serves some people's interests, the interests of people with power and privilege.